All right. And I'd also ask too, if people could kindly keep yourselves muted for at least the first part of the meeting. And we're hoping to have plenty of time at the end for any questions or discussion that people would like to have. I just want to start tonight by saying welcome. My name is Linda Lukasic. I'm the Executive Director at Environment Hamilton, and you are here tonight for the webinar, We Stop Sprawl, What Comes Next? I'm here tonight co-hosting with Nancy Hurst from Stop Sprawl Hamont. So really happy to have Nancy here with me tonight. And as I already said, we're recording tonight. We'll do a Q&A at the end, and at the Q&A, you'll be welcomed to raise your hand and unmute and ask your question, or you can type it in the chat. We'll be making sure that we check either way, and we have Zoe Green here tonight with us helping to monitor the chat. And one other thing that I do want to add for anyone who needs it, there is a closed captioning capability, an automated one on this meeting. So if you do need that, you just need to go to the bottom taskbar, and if you don't see closed captioning there should be, you'll see 3 dots and it says more underneath. You should be able to click on that and activate the closed captioning for the meeting. So next slide, please.
Oh,
there we go. Thanks, Nancy. So here's our agenda for tonight, so you know what's coming. I've just done introductions. In a moment, we'll have Nancy doing a land acknowledgement. I'm going to give a very brief recap of where we are now and how we got here, an overview of what is being proposed by city planners, and then Nancy and I are both going to talk about where we need to go and what it can look like. And of course, we always have next steps and actions that you can take. And I haven't put this on this agenda, but of course there'll be opportunity at the end for questions and answers. So I'm going to hand things over right now to Nancy to do the land acknowledgement. Nancy.
Thank you so much, Linda. And so I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. The territory was a subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Nancy, for that. So tonight's session is going to provide you with basic information to help you to be able to respond to the policy changes that are being proposed by City of Hamilton planning staff. And these are policy changes that are designed to contain urban growth within our existing urban boundary between now and 2051, so for the next 30 years. And I also want to note, and we'll mention this several times tonight with details, is that the city very recently announced dates and times for 2 virtual public information sessions. In fact, we shifted ours to tonight because we had originally scheduled for tomorrow night, which is when the first session is happening with the city planners, and that's February 17th starting at 6 p.m. So we really urge you to sign up for the city session, and we hope you can use what you hear from us tonight to help to inform your feedback to city's planning staff on the pathway forward. We're going to include the registration link in the chat, and again, we'll share more details later. And then I also want to say that we have prepared an action sheet for tonight. So anything you hear us talking about, you'll get that information in that action sheet, and I will be emailing that out to all of you immediately after the session. And that includes links to the registration for the city's events and for anything else that we talk about here tonight. So it's hopefully you won't have to stress about scrambling to write things down. Okay, so at the bigger picture level, I'm going to say to you that we strongly support much of what we see in the city's proposed pathway forward, and we urge you to do the same. But of course, you know, it's always important to look at the details, and that's what we'll be doing tonight. Next slide, please, Nancy.
Yeah. Oh dear. Yeah, it's not advancing. So if you just give me a second, I'm going to try and fiddle with it a bit because my usual trick isn't working.
There we go.
I'll do my best.
Okay, thanks. All right, so I'm just going to give a sort of a whirlwind recap of where we are and how we got here. And many of you have traveled on this journey with us, so lots of it will be familiar. Just want to start by saying the city planning department's timeline. This is their time. This is the city's timeline. from December of 2020, which doesn't even appear on this, we started with planning staff coming to council at the General Issues Committee and recommending that ambitious density option, which would have consumed over 3,000 acres of prime farmland. In January and February, we started to outreach to community and share details about our concerns related to the proposal. So by March of 2021, we'd already seen Stop Sprawl Hamont emerge, whole lot of community mobilization, and a huge show of community mobilization at that March General Issues Committee meeting, with delegations, both written and spoken, and a commitment from councillors to send out that household survey that included a no boundary option choice. And then what happened from there was a whole lot of really hard work campaigning to get people to fill out that survey. And of course, we have the Stop Sprawl signs hovering there over the timeline, because you all know we did a lot of work to distribute those signs into the community. Next click, Nancy. And all of this culminated in November with a vote from General Issues Committee to keep the boundary firm. And I'm going to repeat, it was a vote of 13-3. And I'm going to remind you all that there were 3 councillors who did not support the firm boundary, and that was councillors Ferguson, Whitehead, and Pearson, but the rest of council supported this direction. And then finally, you'll see the green circle, and this is essentially where we are right now. So in January of this year, we saw city staff come back to planning committee this time with the proposed amendments to official plans and the pathway forward. And they were seeking 2 things in that January meeting. One was to be able to go out and consult with the public on the proposed changes. And the second was to be allowed to submit the proposed changes to the Provincial Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. And the ministry, it's a 90-day period over which they review and provide feedback to the municipality on the proposed pathway forward. So that is where we are right now. And what I'd like to do is start to delve into the details of some of what was presented to council, to committee and council, and that we all now have an opportunity to provide feedback on. Okay. Okay, so I'm gonna dive into this overview, and as I say, January 11th is when the details came forward to planning committee. They were ultimately given the blessing at a council meeting. We lost quorum at a planning committee meeting, and it ended up at council that the approval was given to move ahead. So I just want to say to you that the key municipal policy documents that are being modified as part of this process are Hamilton's urban and rural official plans. And it's the urban official plan, I think it's fair to say, that is the most important one here, because this is where all of the major policy changes are being put in place. And it's going to set out how we're going to be able to accommodate urban growth within the urban boundary for the next 30 years. So I wanted to share this slide because I think it's really important that you're aware of this. This is text that's included in the official plan, and it sets out the principles of the plan, how the official plan is supposed to work. So I always feel like bigger picture understanding of what is the intent is a really important place to start. And maybe just to step back a little bit too, for anyone on the call who's not aware of what an official plan is all about and what its purpose is, in very simple terms, an official plan is meant to describe a municipality's policies on how land in the municipality should be used. So this kind of sets the stage with the principles: compact and healthy urban communities that provide opportunities to live, work, play, and learn. I think this one is interesting because this isn't a new principle. This existed in the previous version: commitment to a strong rural community protected by firm urban boundaries. I'm not going to read through all of these, but I do want to highlight the principles that are bolded are newly proposed principles that staff have incorporated into the official plan and that we have an opportunity to provide feedback on. So you can see reference here to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and adapting to the impacts of a changing climate. And this is something obviously the city our council has expressed commitment to take action on. We all wish they would move faster, but they have declared a climate emergency, and there was direction from the province for municipalities to reference the climate crisis They make reference now to a wide range and healthy supply of housing options for current and future residents, a critical issue, and planning for a city that is equitable and inclusive and which meets the evolving needs of Hamilton's diverse population. Next slide, please, Nancy. Okay. Okay, so first of all, I just want to say to you, this is a drawing, so it's not an actual map of a place. Nancy and I had a funny conversation about this earlier. This is a diagram the city uses just to help to explain the different boundaries. So you can see here, we have a rural area in Hamilton. The sort of pinky area within the red lines is the urban area. But I find this diagram really useful, and I'm going to use it right now to help you to understand the difference between designated greenfield area, or DGA, and urban built up area. So now that we're proceeding with a firm urban boundary, these two types of land are really important for us to think about. So DGA, designated greenfield area, is essentially land that's within the urban boundary already, but that's not yet developed. So that's one category. And then everything else is the built up area. And that's what this map shows. And in most municipalities, no surprise, the bulk of the land base within the urban boundary is the built up area. And Nancy, if you could go to the next slide. And so this gives you a sense of this. So on this map, you can see sort of a gray area, and that's rural Hamilton. And the sort of fleshy colored area is the urban built up area in Hamilton. And as you can see, most of the land base is built up urban area. You can see white chunks here, and most of the white, aside from the airport, would be designated greenfield area. And I want to point out in Hamilton, you'll see a lot of white near the airport, and that's designated greenfield area that's been designated for employment uses. But there are other areas. You can see Binbrook out towards Stony Creek, Waterdown. There are other areas where we do have DGA that's intended for residential development. Next slide, please, Nancy. Okay, so I'm just going to start to walk through just some of the current provincial planning policy and how it applies. So when we talk about designated greenfield area, we've got provincial planning policy that's been set out in the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe that dictates that for Hamilton as a municipality, in our designated greenfield area, Hamilton is obligated to plan to accommodate a minimum of 50 people and jobs per hectare. So DGA density measurements are based on people and jobs per hectare. In our urban built up area, Hamilton has to meet a minimum target of 50% intensification. And what that means is that 50% of all of the new residential units built have to be built within that urban built up area. So that's a way to facilitate intensification right across the spectrum, whether it's gentle intensification or high density intensification. So really important to note that these are minimum targets. And I just want to say that just to give you a little bit of a sense of where the city of Hamilton has gone with designated greenfield area density and the percent intensification target for the built up urban area. I'm going to share those numbers with you now. In the designated greenfield areas, the density being proposed by city planning staff is for 60 people and jobs per hectare. So it's higher than the proposed minimum that the province has set out of 50. But I'm going to tell you that what's important to note is that it's not as high as the minimum 80 people and jobs per hectare that you see here on this chart that's required to support frequent transit service. So that would be bus every 10 to 15 minutes. And I'm going to say to you that if we're looking at using that designated greenfield area as wisely as possible, building climate resilient neighborhoods there, that we're urging you to really push for the municipality to bump that number up higher than the current 60 that's proposed. This is going to be really important for us in the future in areas within the urban boundary that haven't been developed yet to get it right. And so I just want to share this chart with you because it's sort of interesting too to think about the reality that transit-oriented development is really dependent on densities. And you can see how you need, it makes common sense. You need more people concentrated in an area to support better transit service. And you can work your way up from basic transit service all the way up to subway, where you really want to see a minimum of 200 residents and jobs combined. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So I just want to talk a little bit now about the urban built-up area. And as I say, that's most of urban Hamilton. The province requires Hamilton, again, to meet that 50% minimum intensification target. So that's a minimum of 50% of all new residential units have to be built within that built-up boundary. City planners are proposing an 80% target. So 80% of all new residential units must be built within the urban built-up area. And I would say to you that this is the most important planning policy shift in the proposal city planning staff have put forward. So I want to share in more detail how city planners envision these new residential units being distributed across the urban built-up area. And again, in the urban built-up area, planners are proposing to develop in key growth centers like downtown Hamilton, nodes and corridors along major transit routes like the East-West LRT line, and in urban neighborhoods. And the added focus on urban neighborhoods in the no urban boundary expansion proposal is also really important, and I'll explain more about that momentarily. But this map shows you the cities, that history of planning based on nodes and corridors. And you can see a couple of other areas, red circles and some of the pink circles, that are smaller nodes than the downtown growth center, which is a really significant one. But the idea is that you connect those nodes with corridors, and there's opportunity for intensification along the corridors as well, where you're providing either higher order transit like an LRT or enhanced bus service. So this sort of vision of nodes and corridors isn't a new concept in Hamilton. It's a community planning vision that's existed for a long time here, with those plans to concentrate higher density growth in that series of nodes. I'm just going to add that this nodes and corridors approach, combined with ongoing development in mostly suburban designated greenfield areas, has really been the city's main approach to accommodating urban growth. And that model has involved urban boundary expansions, as we all know, out into rural Hamilton over time. I can remember the most recent one would have been the Airport Employment Growth District, or Aerotropolis, and that was a boundary expansion to bring more employment lands into the urban boundary. But prior to that, we've had other boundary expansions that happened into rural Hamilton, into rural farmland, prime farmland for housing. So, and here we were in December of 2020 and into early 2021, really heading down a pathway that would have resulted in yet another urban expansion into prime farmland, this time to build more houses again. But higher densities in designated greenfield areas and accommodating more growth and nodes, including downtown Hamilton and corridors, combined with a new focus on updating residential zoning rules in urban neighborhoods, is what we need today to avoid loss of more farmland to sprawl, and to adequately respond to the climate emergency, and to ensure that we see a good mix of housing types, including affordable housing. So think back to those principles of the official plan. This is what's really going to help us to make that happen. And I think the really exciting thing right now is that this is what city planners are starting to propose in these changes that we see in the form of amendments to the official plan. So in this current planning policy proposal, again, that nodes and corridors focus continues. And the focus, I would argue, is now supercharged by higher order transit. We know that there's an LRT, fixed LRT line going ahead that'll run from McMaster to Eastgate Square. And that really provides a wonderful opportunity to facilitate and maximize intensification with higher densities at every LRT stop, and intensification with residential and commercial developments along the entire LRT corridor. So this is transit-oriented development. It's really meant to encourage people to be able to live and move around a community, ideally without a car. And hopefully we'll see that over time. Next slide, please, Nancy. Well, there are other important nodes with potential for significant growth along the LRT. And I just want to say, before I describe Eastgate, this is the blast network. So there's the LRT line, but we've also got these proposals for other frequent transit service lines. So these could ultimately end up being bus rapid transit lines, at least express lines. And again, the same idea, we'll see more growth along these corridors, and that's an important part of the city's plan moving forward. Next slide. I just also want to point out that there are other important nodes with potential for significant growth along the LRT, because I think a lot of people are wondering now, where is the growth going to happen? And a key one, and I always like to talk about this when it's in my neighborhood, is the eastern terminus of the LRT, the Centennial Neighborhoods and Eastgate Square, the Queenston Centennial stretch here. And this area has a relatively new neighborhood secondary plan. And the secondary plan is an even more detailed blueprint than the official plan that guides how a community is going to evolve and grow. And it's already designed to transform the sea of parking lots at Eastgate Square that we refer to as gray fields into transit-oriented residential and commercial development. And Eastgate Square is a struggling suburban mall, so it's really ripe for redevelopment. And the density will be high along that Queenston Road and corridor. And then as well, down at the north end of Centennial, just above the railway tracks at the top of the map is the Confederation Go Station, which will ultimately have full GO train service. So you can see it makes a whole lot of sense, and there's huge opportunity here for lots of transit-oriented development. And you can see on the map there are numbers. So the darker colored areas are where buildings can be taller. So I think we've got, as of right now, building heights of up to 20 stories in this area. And I'm fully expecting with the firm urban boundary decision, we may even see the city circle back and facilitate more intensification happening in this area, because it just makes a lot of sense for it to happen here. Next slide, please. And I just wanted to share this with you. This is the Town Urban Growth Center and the boundaries of it. With what staff are proposing, there's a whole lot more intensification proposed for this location. Something we all may want to critically reflect on a bit and decide whether we think it's too much, whether there are other ways that this growth could be accommodated in some of the other areas within the built-up urban boundary. But again, for a whole lot of reasons, it does make sense to accommodate more people in the core. I'm sure some of you may have seen the article in the spec about the census data results that show a lot of people moving into the city are drawn into the core or drawn into neighborhoods very close to the core. So this is a very good sign that if we're going to talk about market, there's a market for housing in this part of Hamilton. And so I'm pretty optimistic that if more is provided, we'll see more people excited to move into this part of our city. Next slide, please. Okay, so I also just wanted to talk too about the neighborhoods designation. And if you think about that urban built-up area, which is most of urban Hamilton that I showed you, a whole lot of that area is low-density residential neighborhoods. Often single-family homes on very large lots. Most of these areas are zoned to keep things the way that they are. Some people refer to it as exclusionary zoning, and argue that the zoning should be more inclusive. So it's low density and low population. But these are fully serviced lands within the urban boundary. And for a whole lot of reasons, climate emergency, the cost to taxpayers, creating communities where good public transit and local amenities are more viable, it makes sense to allow more gentle infill to happen in these neighborhoods. And I'm going to say it started already, even before we ended up here with a firm urban boundary, the city was starting to develop planning policies to facilitate gentle density in urban neighborhoods. So any of you who were involved in the public consultations around the second dwelling unit policy that the city now has in place, you'll know that that piece is now in place. So as of right, in urban neighborhoods across the city, people can add a second dwelling unit, let's say an apartment, to their primary residence. They can also build, subject to, spacing requirements, a garden suite or a laneway suite in the rear of their property. So those are options now that people can choose. And we know that lots of people are moving forward on that. It's really exciting to see, especially it seems to be happening a lot in lower city neighborhoods. And anyone who's interested in learning more, there's a great Facebook group called Laneway Suites in Hamilton, and you'll see lots of examples where people have already finished with building an accessory unit on their property, or they're in the process and sharing their progress and asking for advice and direction from others who've already been through it. So it's something that's already happening and exciting to see. But there's a lot more that could be happening. You'll see here, this is the proposed official plan policy change that's really important when we're talking about this piece. So city planners are proposing that uses permitted in low density residential areas shall include, so it would work the same way as the second dwelling unit policy, single detached, semi-detached, duplex, triplex, fourplex, and street townhouse dwellings, and may include multiple dwellings. So it's a may, which means it's not a given. You'd have to get the approvals. Multiple dwellings containing a maximum of 6 units for lots in proximity to collector roads or arterial roads. So more on the outer edges of a neighborhood. So the city is going to be going through, they've set this out in the official plan proposed amendments, but it's going to trigger kind of a continuation of what started with the second dwelling unit. So there's a residential zoning project that the city is only partway through. So planners are saying, we'll continue on with that public process to review and update residential zoning bylaws to facilitate our ability to accommodate more infill in our urban neighborhoods right across the city. So again, with this policy change, we really support this change for a whole lot of reasons, and we'd urge you to do the same. And we would add that as these policies are translated into residential zoning rules, that this also provides an important opportunity for community to push for more policies for housing affordability and accessibility in our city. Other jurisdictions have gone down this path in recent years, and there are some good examples of how to do this effectively. So I just want to share one of those examples with you, and you've probably seen, a number of us have shared this one over social media. So next slide. And this is the residential infill project in Portland, Oregon. And this visual really nicely summarizes what Portland's residential zoning changes allow and achieve. The residential zoning rules include some of the same basic elements as what Hamilton planners are proposing here, but there's some additional really interesting elements, and they include things like a maximum house size for single family homes in an urban area. They've reduced that from the previously allowed 6,750 square feet to 2,500 square feet. So I found that one really interesting, because you think about urban areas and how land is used. There's a good argument to be made that there should be limits. So that's part of what Portland has put in place. The residential zoning allows cottage clusters on a lot. So you can see at the top of the diagram, an illustration of a cottage cluster, which is also sort of interesting, smaller, almost communal homes on a lot. For 3 and 4 plexes, at least one home must be visible with a no-step entry, wide doorways, ground floor, bed and bath. So in other words, accessible. So if you think about the importance of that in our community, that's a wonderful requirement. Affordable housing projects need 2 such accessible units. And then they also offer, and I thought this was really interesting, deep affordability bonuses for developers to allow up to 6 units on a site when half of those units are affordable to households earning up to 60% of the median family income. So I just included this quote, and this was on the City of Portland website, and it says, expanding the kinds of housing choices that are available in our residential neighborhoods is an important step to give more people the the opportunity to live close to schools, parks, and jobs at a variety of price points. So that mixing up of the types of housing forms that are out there really done right can help with affordability. Next slide, please. And while I'm talking about affordability, we need to also be pushing to ensure we see more deeply affordable and affordable. And for those of you who have spent any time thinking about affordability, deeply affordable is the really subsidized housing, social housing. Affordable, and we need to be careful about this, because when you hear people talk about affordable, it could be lower than market, but not deeply affordable, because we have hit a point where there are more and more people in our community who are struggling with paying for housing costs. So sort of different levels of affordability we need to stay tuned into. But we do need more of both types of housing, residential housing being built along and close to our LRT route, especially in the vicinity of LRT stations. And there are tools the city can use to do this, including tools set out in provincial policy like inclusionary zoning. And I just wanted to mention that here tonight, because we're watching other municipalities as they update their official plans talking about inclusionary zoning, and that conversation hasn't started in Hamilton in the public realm. So that's part of why I wanted to make you all aware of this session happening on March the 10th. There are a number of us as organizations coming together and wanting to start the dialogue. The City of Toronto has a policy in place now, so we'll have speakers from the City of Toronto at this event, and we're really going to be talking about how can we collectively advocate to get this piece moving in Hamilton, so that we don't miss out on opportunities to make sure that we have a mix of housing types and a range of affordability along our LRT route. And this is all about building climate resilient, inclusive communities. And we want to make sure people who depend on transit are able to live close to fantastic transit facilities like the LRT that's coming. Next slide, please, Nancy. So I wanted to share this too, because I've talked a lot about the different approaches that the city is using and that big change with neighborhood residential zoning changes. I just want to summarize. In Hamilton, we're looking at an increase in our population projected by the province, and there's debate about how accurate these numbers out to 2051 of 820,000 people and 360,000 jobs. So this chart summarizes within the urban built-up area, how city planners are proposing to distribute the number of additional residential units that we need to be built over the next 30 years. So I wanted to share that with you just so that you could see what they are proposing right now. So there's quite a jump in the intensification target for the downtown urban growth center. Pretty healthy amount of the growth planners envision will happen in other urban nodes and along those corridors, whether it's the LRT corridor, the blast network. And then in those urban neighborhoods, the projection is that we could see an additional 26,484 residential units in those locations. So I just wanted to share that with you just to give you a sense of that. And then in addition, there are an additional 21,600 residential units that will be accommodated within those designated greenfield areas that we talked about earlier. So that gives you sort of a bigger picture sense, and you may want to provide feedback to the municipality on how you feel about those allocations. There may be a different way to do this that works better, but that's the plan that they've put out there at this point. Next slide, Nancy. And hopefully you can do this part. Nancy and I were having fun earlier. These are two maps. So this, just bear in mind that the darker the blue, the higher the number of units being allocated to an area. So this is what the map looks like if the municipality proceeds with ambitious density and that expansion out into Elfrida and 20 Road and some of the other expansion areas into rural Hamilton. And then Nancy, if you jump to the next map, this is how it looks without those pieces there. We'll share a link to the slide deck. So when you're all sitting on your own computers, it's kind of fun to quickly jump back and forth between these two maps. I know it sounds silly, but it gives you a really good sense of the difference between the two proposals. And when you jump back and forth, you notice that elimination of the need for Elfrida. But what you see just through the darkness of the map, when you go to the no boundary expansion option, you can see where the growth is going to be accommodated within the urban built up area, but also within the designated greenfield areas. And it doesn't look crazy. I'm going to say that out loud. I mean, it looks like a pretty reasonable distribution of growth within existing areas. So try that out, see what you think. I think it's interesting just to get you feeling a little bit more familiar with what the city is proposing here. And then last slide, Nancy, for me. I just wanted to finish by saying, and I haven't spoken to this part of things in much detail, but there are a lot of other changes being proposed in these official plan amendments, and there are elements there focused on climate, probably not as much as a lot of us would want to see. So I just wanted to finish commenting a little bit about that and underscoring the need to build a climate resilient, inclusive future for Hamilton. It's the right thing to do. Why wouldn't we want to do it? It makes so much sense. It's going to create better quality of life in our neighborhoods. And this is what we need to do. So I really encourage you to, when you're thinking about feedback to the municipality, ask questions about the climate emergency and how the city is dealing with it. In reviewing the documents, I can tell you I have some concerns. There's reference to the Community Climate Action Plan. I'm sure lots of you were involved in the development of that plan way back in 2015, but it's not a plan that's designed to help us in any meaningful way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to track our success in doing that. What will help us with that is something called the Community Energy and Emissions Plan that our city planning staff have been working on for a couple of years now. We're waiting for a draft. We need that to move forward. It's not even referenced in this official plan. So certainly at a minimum, we'd urge you to tell city staff that that needs to happen. And I guess associated with that and associated with building better communities, we also need green development standards. And we're hearing city staff finally talking about that. And again, we want to see that referenced in the official plan. We want a commitment that that's going to be part of where we're moving with this fantastic new direction that we're heading in the city of Hamilton. I'm going to pass it over to Nancy now.
Thank you so much, Linda. Always so much to learn. Well, hi, everybody. I'm Nancy, and I'm one of the organizers of Stop Sprawl and also of Save Our Streams Hamilton. And those are two grassroots initiatives that both are dedicated to saving farmland, wetlands, and wildlife habitat in London, mainly on the Hamilton Mountain, where, along with several thousand Hamiltonians, we were successful in achieving a firm urban boundary, just as Halton has done this evening, which is great news. Well, I'm super excited to be here because after a long slog of a year with the Stop Sprawl campaign, now it feels like we finally get to do the fun part, which is, having a look around and seeing what direction Hamilton will be going with regard to our growth. So the hope is that we can I think I muted myself. The host muted me, and I'm the host, so I guess it's me. Look around the world and see what sort of developments that we see that are sustainable, compact, more equitable, and which add gentle density to our existing urban areas. So the goal is being to save farmland and build climate-resistant communities and support residents by including accessible and affordable housing options, and promote decent public transit and employment opportunities within existing neighborhoods. So as Linda mentioned, the reason we put this webinar together tonight is to give everybody the chance to hop onto the city's webinar tomorrow. The Engage Hamilton website is a really interesting place to go if you're looking for a place to add your voice to all the different sorts of projects that are happening in the city of Hamilton. Of course, tonight we're concerning ourselves with the one that's going to be happening, the two virtual public sessions that are happening, one tomorrow and one is on February 22nd during the daytime. So the point being that, we want to help everybody to be tooled up so that you can attend those meetings, or one of those meetings at least, and be able to help the city steer this whole no boundary expansion ship in the direction that we want it to go. And just a quick note, it was in December 2020 when I attended one of Linda's excellent webinars, Will Sprawl Take It All? And I first learned about the city's sprawl agenda. And that webinar is what led to the whole Stop Sprawl campaign and ultimately led to our firm urban boundaries. So never underestimate the power of a bunch of engaged Hamiltonians sitting around in their pajamas on a cold winter evening watching a webinar, because those are the sorts of things that begin movements. And I want to just say a big shout out to Linda for her unwavering commitment to public outreach and education in this city, because our city is so much richer thanks to your efforts. So obviously, one of the big reasons that we want to increase density in all our neighborhoods is for there to be enough residents to support a viable, decent public transit system. In the case of the LRT, the city is planning for intensification, as Linda said, around stations, along the transit corridors, and radiating out into the surrounding neighborhoods. And again, as Linda mentioned, the province has mandated a density target of 160 people and jobs per hectare immediately around the stations. And it's important that we advocate also for high quality developments in these areas. For instance, we want mixed use, meaning commercial businesses on the ground level and levels of accommodation above. And I also think this is our chance to hammer home the need to include affordable as well as deeply affordable housing and family-friendly units near the stations, the corridors, and in the surrounding neighborhoods. I think we need maybe a little less deluxe executive single bedroom condos that really only the top earners can afford. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about the density that is being planned for within the transit line, the LRT line, there's a really interesting user-friendly city document, which is entitled Mapping the Major Transit Areas. And it lays out in an easy to read format just what kind of intensification is being planned in all the neighborhoods along the many different LRT stops. So I'm just going to whiz through some pictures that I put together showing some ideas of what we might want to see here in Hamilton going forward. So for instance, this is Sandyford Place on Duke Street, and I think it was built in the late 1800s for railroad executives. It's a beautiful building, and unfortunately, this style has been largely cast aside, probably around in the 50s when the car became king and we began developing our neighborhoods around the automobile rather than around people. These are some great examples of middle density that people will instantly recognize as being from Montreal. And anyone who's visited that city will know that this is a really fun experience because it's walkable, it has great public transit, active transit infrastructure, like bike lanes are everywhere, and mixed use developments like the example on the right where the grocer and the wine cellar is nestled right inside a residential neighborhood. The interesting thing to note is that the density of Montreal is 890 people per square kilometer, which is roughly double that of Hamilton, which has only 480 people per square kilometer. And then when you look at downtown Montreal, it's even greater with a density of 2,719 people per square kilometer. And they achieve all this with a majority of these 3-story buildings, these walk-ups, and very few tall towers, which would be a great model for Hamilton. This is obviously a great example of a school that's repurposed into lofts. This is the Stinson Lofts, and it seems to have been really embraced by the neighborhood. The only thing I would personally say is that it would be great to, in fact, intensify the neighborhood and keep the local schools open, but this is still a beautiful example of an adaptive reuse. maybe somebody knows about this home. I drive past it often near Bayfront Park, and it reminds me of a similar proposal on the mountain, which was 2 detached houses that was proposed to share a driveway with parking in the back, but that one was turned down. One of the reasons was that the neighbors objected was headlights in my backyard at night. But I mean, my bedroom faces the street and I have headlights in my front yard. Anybody whose house is on a street is going to have to deal with headlights. So these are the sorts of objections I think that we need to overcome. This is another example of another school that was repurposed into condos. And right across the street is a modest apartment block that's pretty much illegal to build with today's zoning laws, just a simple 3-story walk up. These are on Murray Street, which is just off Bay Street. And this is something I noticed on the mountain the other day. I was happy to see this go up. It's on West 5th and it's visible from the link. And it is sitting right within a well-established residential neighborhood. So I'm really looking forward to seeing more of this sort of scale of development happening within Hamilton neighborhoods, you know, and not just on major transit areas, but actually in a neighborhood. And this is another example of a modest apartment in a residential neighborhood that blends in just fine. This is a townhouse development on the mountain. And one thing I've noticed when I am poking around the planning committee agendas, there are always a number of letters from people who maybe are opposing developments in their neighborhoods. And one of the major mentions really are from people who are opposed to these developments because of concerns for increased traffic. But I just wanted to say, I mean, I visit this community regularly. It's a very dense community. And I rarely, if ever, encounter another vehicle on the road when I'm driving in there at the same time. In fact, the streets are narrow, and in the summer, the kids are all playing on the streets. And having so many neighbors in close quarters has really fostered a great sense of community here. So another issue I heard in some of the planning committee letters was that people were concerned that more neighbors would diminish their Wi-Fi signal and can encourage undesirables to hang around at the community mailboxes. But again, I haven't encountered any of those issues here in this really dense neighborhood. So rather than a monster home for one family, why not consider the same size structure to accommodate 2, 3, or even 4 families? Calgary has been doing this for years, building duplexes ever since they decided to limit their sprawl and start densifying within their communities. Lots of different options for building duplexes, triplexes, and quads that we could definitely be modeling here in Hamilton. And I like this communal space here in between these 2 townhouse developments where they have the parking in the back, keeping the cars away, and a nice sort of shared car-free path in the front of all these developments. And of course, Europe has been doing this for years, well, centuries really. And this is why when we visit Europe, we pay a premium to visit these sorts of beautiful neighborhoods that we're trying to recreate here. This is an image of Oxford Street in London. They're going to be pedestrianizing a big chunk of it. So what was once a total car-dominated, car-centric area has now been devoted back to the people. This is a Vancouver development, and Vancouver is hemmed in by mountains and ocean. So they really do have to get creative with what they're building. And I liked this one because it's got a nice sort of community hub in the middle of everything. And I think it's a great sort of model for how to build a community. And Linda shared this image with me. It's from Brampton. It's their vision of their downtown with lots of mixed use and step backs on the upper levels and dwellings above, which really open the space up. And as Linda mentioned, if only this was Eastgate or even Upper Wentworth at Lime Ridge Mall. And when completed, this area here in Brampton, did I say Brantford? I meant Brampton. This location will have 100,000 people within a 5 to 10 minute walk of a transit station. So that's a lot of people accommodated in a nice compact area. So these last few slides here were, thanks Chris, who sent me a link, are showing the development that's coming to Pier 8, except it's missing the tower, which we're still deciding on. Not maybe the most popular part of this, but it's an interesting compact development. And I was listening to the planning meeting yesterday. I don't know if anybody else was, but I learned that the project is approved for 1,645 units. And 15% of those units, which would be 264, must be family sized, meaning that they have to have 2 bedrooms or more. But I would say that we probably could increase the amount of bedrooms for a family sized unit, given that most people often have more than 1 kid, I would say. And I think there's certainly room to develop a few more family sized units and certainly affordable units in this sort of area here. And so finally, if there's anybody here tonight that's interested in taking a more active role in supporting the kind of development applications that we are seeing and that we will be seeing coming down the line in Hamilton, as Density is embraced, we are encouraging people to add their names to a list that we've called PART, P-A-R-R-T, Planning, Application, Review, and Response Team. Sounds like there should be sirens involved. Our aim is to share information with each other about great applications coming down the planning committee or the committee of adjustment, so that we can send in letters of support or even register to delegate to those committees in favor of such proposals, just so that committee members can hear a more balanced perspective from residents who are in favor of developments rather than just hearing from those who are not. Thank you very much, Linda. Go right ahead.
Thanks, Nancy. If you could move to the next slide, please. All right, so we just wanted to quickly let you all know what's in store for us in the coming months, because the city, like other municipalities in the province, is going through this process of conforming, bringing their official plans up to date with provincial policy, and that's, you know, including that requirement to share plans for accommodating growth to 2051. So you already know we are now in the open houses non-statutory public consultation phase, and that's February to March. This is the city's timeline. But just very quickly, so you can see, by the time we hit late April of this year, the city will be holding a statutory open house under the Planning Act, and then a statutory public meeting in the Planning Committee, with the ultimate goal of finalizing and adopting the Urban Hamilton official plan. And they're aiming to have that done by late May, early June, aiming to get it done by that July 1st provincial deadline. So we just wanted to share that with you so that you know there are other meetings coming after this, the consultations that'll take place now. And next slide, Nancy. Okay, and then this is just, again, we told you we'd keep reminding you about this one, just more information about the public open houses, the virtual open houses that the city planning staff are hosting. First one tomorrow night, second one Tuesday. You'll get that action sheet with the links for registering, and Zoe has kindly put the link back into the chat for you. Next slide. Nancy, I think you were going to speak to this one.
Yeah, I don't find that the city's sign up pages are very easy to understand. So just there on the left where I put the red box, when you click on the link to register, it's kind of small to see. So that's what you want to click on, is that word register. That's what you're going to click on, and then you can add your name to the list. Took me a while to figure that out. Go ahead, Lynn.
Thanks, Nancy. And I should just add, and we know this through past cycles, that if you show up at one of those sessions or you provide written comments, and we should add that in addition to these virtual public information centers, there is an online survey available right now. And again, the action sheet that we're going to email you has a link to that. So you can also go in and provide your feedback on all of this via a survey. It's pretty intense. We'll warn you ahead of time, because what planning staff have done is they've got different themes you can work your way through. So there may be a theme about urban growth management, and you'll go in there and they're literally charts full of text that show you the proposed changes to the official plan. And then there's a text box and you can provide your feedback. So it's not for the faint of heart, but it does give you a way to see those details. But what I would also say is you can also use that text box just to share what you think you need to share. You could, do it under the different themes if you want to do it that way. But for sure, if you want to provide input, there are a number of different ways to do it. And what's important to remember is that planning staff then summarize all of that public input, and they share that in a report that will go back to council. So it's a really helpful way for you to get your perspectives on all of this registered and back to council. Next slide, please, Nancy. I think it may be our last one. Yep, it is. And I'm just going to add quickly too. The action sheet has a number of pieces there. There's one other piece that just emerged. We just found out about this week, and I'm going to mention it quickly. And again, there's a link to it and a survey from the city that you can fill out. But the city, for the first time ever, from what I understand, is developing a parks master plan. So I think for a lot of you, and I've had these conversations already with people, as you start to think about more growth being accommodated within the urban boundary, an immediate thing to think about is, well, what is that going to mean for green space, even on someone's property? Well, part of what the city is doing, recognizing that we are heading in the direction of more people living within the urban boundary, is we do have a need to look at park space and ensuring we have quality park space accessible to everybody, no matter where you live in the city. So they're starting that process, and there's a survey that you can provide your feedback on. The city is asking people for creative ideas. So I've even heard reference, I think it was Joy Coleman wrote a piece that makes reference to the possibility of converting, streets into parks. And so there's lots of interesting stuff happening there. We'd urge you to look at that. But I'm going to stop now, and I think we're happy to open it up for questions. And I don't know, Nancy, should we unshare the screen and then people can see each other?
Sounds good.
And again, we're happy to take questions. Either way, you can type a question into the chat. I know Zoe's been tracking that, and so maybe what we could do is alternate. I see a virtual hand up, so maybe we could start with the virtual hand and then go to any questions that are in the chat.
Chris, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I'm sure some people saw my commenting in the chat. My main question is about the province. So I'm glad to see that Halton voted against urban boundary expansion, because that hopefully protects us a little bit. But I've heard some commentary that people think that the province may override the city. So my questions are, one, have we heard anything about that, and how likely that is, considering there's an election coming somewhat soon? And two, is there a plan to mobilize on that? If the province were to kind of force the expansion, the city still could just say okay, but then still put in policies that we were talking about tonight and moving forward. So is there, that's my second question, I guess.
Yeah, I could start, and Nancy, and I know we've got some other, I know Don McLean is here and Zoe Green, others who have been part of our core Stop Sprawl group. So I'll start by saying my understanding is that yes, I mean, the city has already submitted all of these proposed changes to the province. There's a 90-day period within which the province reviews, and so we know in April, that's I think mid-April, we should get that feedback from the province. There's a formal commitment from city planning staff that they'll share those results and any reaction they have to them. But we do know that at the end of the day, the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing could turn down what the city is proposing. I think it's going to be hard to do if the municipality puts a plan forward that works, as far as the rules that have been set out. And we all believe very firmly that this approach achieves that, just in terms of the methodology that has to be followed and what's been put on the table here. So I think it'll be interesting to see, Chris, is what I would say, you know, especially in the lead up to an election, and now that much more with 2 municipalities taking a position that they don't want to have to expand out at, you know, at this point in time. I mean, you know, if you think about, I keep saying to people, this is the do or die decade on climate, and we're blowing boundaries out and gobbling up prime farmland. That seems crazy. But I don't know if others, Nancy, do you have anything to add to that?
Only that over and over, the land use lawyer, Phil Poffin from Environmental Defense, has always maintained that what we're proposing is compliant with the provincial methodology. So from a legal perspective, I think that we are compliant. I'm just going to go with what the lawyer says. Maybe Dawn has something to add, but Dawn looks pretty relaxed right now.
I'm relaxed, and I'm really pleased to see Halton taking the same direction as Hamilton. And I think that makes the position of the possibilities of the provincial government meddling less likely. The danger may be a re-elected majority Ford government that decides to mess things up after it gets re-elected. But I don't expect that we're going to see something in those directions between now and June. I think the danger may be, since this has to be finalized for July. If we have a new Ford government at that point, and it's a majority, then they may start messing around, because that's the point at which they would be finalizing. Official plans of municipalities at the end of the day are finalized by the provincial government. That's how the rules work. I would expect that they would see an enormous revolt if they started to do that, but we clearly have a government that has other objectives than what I think most of the people on the call here tonight have, in terms of climate, which it doesn't seem to have any objective other than just to carry on as usual, and what is most profitable for developers, which it seems to be particularly enthusiastic about.
Thanks for your questions, Chris. We're going to go next to Ed Reese.
Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's great that Hamilton City Council has frozen Hamilton's boundaries, and it's fantastic that Halton has also made that the same decision. But I've just learned this evening that apparently there is a proposal to develop about 1,000 acres in Smithville, which is right outside of Hamilton. I'm just wondering if people are aware of this, and I'm just wondering if this is the strategy of the developers to go outside of those areas where the boundaries are frozen and just build in areas where the boundaries are not frozen.
Yeah, Ed, I am aware of what's happening in Niagara region, and it's really unfortunate. And it's an interesting municipality because you think about cities like St. Catharines within Niagara region. And unlike Hamilton, St. Catharines is built right out to the edge of the Greenbelt. They don't have, so in some ways, you know, what you're seeing now is rather than trying to accommodate more growth within the existing regional boundary, the expansion is happening out into areas that aren't Greenbelt. So that area to the south of Smithville is still, it's farmland, but it's not Greenbelt protected. But I think this also circles back to conversations that we really need to be having around how are we approaching farmland protection at a higher level within the province of Ontario. And I know there are a lot of people out there, I've heard farmers say this, and I certainly agree and support this perspective. It feels like the solution to all of this is solid policy that in a comprehensive way protects farmland in Ontario so that we don't end up in situations. And we heard this from developers and planners in Hamilton who said, if we make our boundary firm here, you're just going to force people and you're going to force sprawl in other communities. And I thought, wait a minute, why is that argument being thrown at us as community advocates to say, you do this and you don't let us, build on the farmland here, and then you're just going to force the problem to be worse somewhere else. That's not, I want to say, that's not our problem. It's a sign that there's a failure at a higher level on the policy front. And I think that's some of what we're seeing there. But certainly, yeah, I think we should be talking about how we can help. I know that there are grassroots activists organizing in Niagara region, and probably what we need to do now is collectively reach out and see how we can support them in their efforts there.
Yeah, it would just be ironic to see farmland in Hamilton not developed at the expense of farmland that is developed in a place like Smithville. So yeah, I think we do need to reach out to Niagara and give them a hand.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We're going to take a question next from Anne Washington.
Okay, Linda actually answered my question before I raised it, was what's the best way to protect farmland and what do we have to do to get those into the green belt. But anyway, the other question, so that was the one question which she sort of answered, and the other one was, in those designated green areas within the boundaries currently, are they currently owned by anybody or are they open for sale?
Yeah, I could start with an answer, Anne, and I have a really detailed map I can share with you if you want to learn. If anybody wants to learn more about designated greenfield areas, they're sort of interesting because in Hamilton, they're at varying stages of development approval. So most of them, my understanding is that the bulk of what they have on the map are parcels of land that are already owned by developers. Some of them are already well on their way through the sort of the development approvals process. Some aren't. So that, yeah, I think we probably need to, I mean, I can share that map and the report, but I can't tell you whether there are massive parcels out there that aren't owned by developers that are just sitting within the urban boundary at this point. I think it's probably fair to say that most of them are in the hands of developers. If you look at sort of the history of how land use has evolved in Hamilton, because we do know, for instance, that most of the land on the rural side of the urban boundary is already in the hands of developers, because it's been this constant march outwards of land speculators scooping up the land and holding on to it. But I don't know if there's anyone, Dawn, have you ever dug into ownership of those parcels? My sense is it's probably the majority are in the hands of developers already within the boundary.
I think you're in a pretty safe ground there, Linda, given the developers' interest in acquiring lands that could be converted into residential subdivisions, because it's a highly profitable process. I think it's also worth noting that lots of these are at the point where building could begin, but the developers make the call as to when they do that. So while and that's true right across the GTA, the Greater Golden Horseshoe, where developers have gotten approval to build subdivisions or develop land, but they're waiting because if housing prices are going up by 25% a year, why build today when you can build tomorrow, next year at this time, and have 25% more profits, or so on and so forth. So it's been really quite deceptive, I think, on the part of the development lobby here to claim that we desperately need to expand the boundary so we have nowhere to build. Well, we've got places that are already within the urban boundary that can be built on, many of which have approvals in place, and it's the developers who are sitting there waiting. Oh, well, we can make more money if we wait. At least that's what it looks like to me.
One of the things that raises is if that's already owned by developers, Don, the chances are that they will be single family, rather high cost houses, right? So I mean, what kind of regulations are there onto what kind of properties are built onto a parcel of land? Or does the developer, can he just submit that land? And if he submit that for the permit, and if he chooses to build all single family high income homes, he can do that?
Not necessarily. We have the density on greenfield sites, which is now set by the province as 50 persons per hectare, was at 80 persons per hectare under the previous government. So if these things were approved under that, that's the kind of density that they would have had to meet. And what I'm seeing in terms of development applications is the developers generally are enthusiastic to make more units on their property rather than less, because they can make more money on it. And lots of the developments that I'm seeing coming down the tubes are certainly more than 80. And is that your observations as well, Linda?
Yeah, and I was just going to say, if you think about that picture Nancy shared in Ancaster with the narrower roadways and that townhome development, when Nancy and I were talking before tonight and just going through slides, I said to her, oh my gosh, I've noticed that kind of, because I'm in the east end of the city, I've noticed that kind of development out off of Barton Street, as you head Stony Creek towards Winona. So there's another example where, yeah, I think it's becoming a common trend that we are seeing developers come back and in some instances wanting to bump up the densities of the greenfield developments, which, done right, I think is a really good thing, an important thing, because, it's like, if you're not doing that, then you're building climate obsolete neighborhoods now that aren't going to be viable moving into the future. We need to get it right now, not only to accommodate that growth, but also to make these communities that are going to be functional as we move into the future.
And not only out of date on climate, but out of date on the municipality being able to afford to maintain the services in those areas. Because a big piece of the problem we're sitting with is we have dense neighborhoods whose density is too low to generate the taxes to be able to maintain the roads and pipes and other services that are necessary to the community. So the rest of the city, where the densities are higher, ends up subsidizing these low density neighborhoods. That's an ongoing problem, not just in Hamilton, but has been one of the historical features of allowing developers to build the kind of houses they feel like building, rather than putting some rules and restrictions on.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne.
I've been watching the chat, and there's some great dialogue and information being shared there. I'm just looking to see if there are any more hands or if people have any questions, anything else that they're curious about. Maybe I can ask a quick question. In terms of the sessions that are being held by the city tomorrow evening and then next week on the 22nd, do we have a sense, is it more productive to sort of provide some general feedback, some general comments, let the city, even just registering, showing up, letting the city know that there are people that support the move to infill, versus maybe braving the survey that you spoke of and delving into some specifics and providing written feedback? Do you have a sense for, is one approach maybe more effective than the other? Or
I'm going to say any approach is helpful. I think it's really important. I think we all learned that with community mobilization around pushing for the firm urban boundary. I think what was so important about that was there were lots of people engaged in all kinds of different ways. So I think everybody's opinion counts here, and I think we can all, whether you're on the city's virtual meeting, sharing your input on what staff are proposing, what you like about it, what you think could be better, or delving into providing detailed written comments or even shorter written comments. I think you can use that survey tool for either. I'm going to say every option, every approach, and all approaches are good, and we're going to encourage them and celebrate them. And maybe I would add, if anyone has questions, or you want some help with preparing input. I didn't put emails on the take action sheet, but you know where you can find us at EH, and happy to connect you with Nancy and Zoe and Dawn and others in our networks, and we're all happy to help you with understanding what's being proposed if you're not sure, but also providing support as you prepare your feedback too.
Thanks, Linda. And I see Nancy has her hand up. She might like to add to that.
It was just that I noticed a question in the chat. It's a different thread now, but maybe Chris, did you want to comment on that before I change the subject then? Or is your question something separate?
I've been writing a lot of stuff, so I don't know what you're talking about.
Oh, okay.
Do you want
Well,
to
I
give me the
see.
topic and then I can?
Okay, well, I'll read the question that I saw. I just didn't know if you wanted to follow on from Linda, because I'm about to change the subject. That's all.
I was too, so.
Okay, good. All right, Karen Gordon wrote in the chat, and it's a question I have too, which is what kinds of initiatives, if any, have been taken into redeveloping the brownfields? And has the city explored incentivizing developers to revitalize brownfields at all? Somebody sent me a CBC article from 2018 that was detailing that a lot of the brownfields had started to be reclaimed, but that was 3 years ago. So Linda, I don't know, does anybody have an answer about brownfields here?
Yeah, I can start. Hamilton for a long time has had it's funny because I'm in other places and I hear people talk about, you've probably heard about the ERASE program, and I forget what the acronym stands for, but there's the municipality has incentivized brownfield redevelopment. The challenge in Hamilton is that most of our brownfields are in old industrial sites and they're really contaminated. So the province has a sort of a regulatory framework around brownfield redevelopment. And the more contaminated a site, you're not going to be surprised to hear me say this, the more it needs to be cleaned up to be able to build residential on it. So it's easier to take a brownfield site that's been used for industrial purposes and to continue to use it for that purpose, or even to transition into lighter industrial. You wouldn't need to do as much cleanup as you do for more sensitive uses like parks and residential. But it does hit a point in a lot of cities where, as the value of land increases, then the economics of doing more in-depth cleanup become more viable. So, there sure are, I'm sure in Toronto, there are examples probably of industrial sites that have been remediated to the level where residential can be built on them. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
I was specifically wondering if if the city has been incentivizing that for developers. But it was good information. Yeah, I just
Yeah, they have been. So if you Google the ERASE program, you'll probably find the details on the city website. And my understanding is there's a whole sort of system in place with the city where they somehow give the developer a break on the taxes and then they increase over time. So it's kind of a way to help them to be able to, I guess, to finance the remediation. And then when they get closer to the end, they eventually get shifted back into, a tax rate that would be reflective of a fully productive property. I think that's really the essence of the incentivizing. There may be, I may not be including all of the pieces there, but I know it's a kind of, it revolves around that piece to a large degree.
Okay, thank you.
Chris, I see that your hand is up, and then there's one more sort of thread from the chat, and maybe we'll start to wrap up after that.
Yeah, sorry, I thought I just had a question. I have two questions actually. The first question was, I'm pretty sure I heard that they're getting rid of the ERASE program. I don't know, maybe I misheard, or maybe it's another incentive. They're saying that they want to get rid of a bunch of incentive programs. I really like the ERASE program because it's really just a property tax deferral. So like in the example of the Kiwi, the reason I know the Kiwi property taxes were $33,000 before and 1.4 million after is because it was part of the ERASE program. And it doesn't really cost the city anything to its most to a certain degree, because it's really not paying the developer anything. It's really just having them not pay property taxes and then slowly reduce it over time. And obviously after the 5 years or whatever that the property tax reduction exists, they get full property taxes, which, like I said, for the Kiwi development is like $1.4 million a year from the entirety of the property, which obviously more than covers the cost of additional services to the building. So it just kind of goes to show why properties should be redeveloped, and especially in the downtown core. That's why places like Toronto have such low property taxes, is because they have a very large downtown, if you haven't noticed. But anyway, I thought I heard about some programs like that being removed, but I don't know, maybe that's something to look, maybe I'm wrong. But my main question is, and maybe I missed this in the presentation, but is there a plan to kind of advocate for reduced parking minimums? I know it was something that the province had done in the past, and then the new provincial government kind of removed it. And it's also a point of contention because a lot of people believe parking is a requirement to exist. And it is for a lot of people. I know that parking minimums typically continue to exist for people who have accessibility needs. And I think my main point is always that parking continues to be built even when there isn't a minimum. You know, Edmonton, Toronto, many other cities have removed parking minimums. Parking continues to get built because, you know, developers need them to sell properties, but they're really expensive to build parking. If people don't know, it's, you know, it can be $50,000, $80,000, $100,000 per stall to build. And if a developer does the math and says this isn't going to be profitable, they just won't build on that property. And those are developments you don't even hear about because they just never even get off the drawing board. So is there like any thought to kind of, you know, advocate for removal or reduction of parking minimums, especially along the LRT route, where I still think they're kind of high right beside LRT stops. And I know North York kind of does that for the subway, where the closer to a stop you are, the lower the parking minimums. Or I mean, I think Toronto maybe just got rid of them altogether now, so I don't think that matters, but.
Yeah. So when Chris is talking about those prices, it's for the, you know, like a condo tower with the underground, the digging down and creating parking that way is really, or I guess even incorporating into the building is when it gets really expensive. So I didn't see anything proposed, at least in the policy amendments that the city is putting forward. But I do know, and you may be aware of this, that the West End Home Builders Association is advocating for the removal of those minimums, because I'm sure they're seeing exactly what you just described, that, you know, it's a costly thing, and as we're transitioning, especially places like the downtown core, it wouldn't be unreasonable to head in a different direction when you have more people moving into units. And it's like Toronto. I mean, the percentage of car ownership in downtown Toronto is very different from a suburb in Hamilton. But that's something I think people could be raising in what they talk about in these sessions with planning staff as a policy that we want to have a conversation about. I haven't seen it formally. I don't know if others combing through all of the rafts of documents associated with the proposed OP amendments have come across anything that makes reference to that.
Dawn, if you have something to add to that quickly, and then yeah, that last question was around the planning, the parking piece, and then the tree bylaw, which will
I haven't seen anything in the documents on the official plan, but there certainly has been a shift in those directions by planning staff, and there have been developments approved with lower minimum parking than would previously have been required. And I think one of the things Toronto has done, our builders in Toronto have done, is they've said there's parking, but when you buy your unit, you don't get a parking spot. You got to buy the parking spot, or you got to pay for the parking spot as a separate thing. And that would be a particularly interesting way to go in terms of you got 3 cars, you're going to pay for an awful lot of parking spots. And at this point in Hamilton, virtually all our parking is free. There's very few streets that have parking meters compared to the overall city as a whole. Compared to Toronto, where we went to visit some friends near the Danforth somewhere, and you had to buy a parking spot on the street overnight. If you wanted to leave your car there overnight, or you wanted to park on the street, you bought it, you go online, you buy the parking spot, you get a ticket or a chit to go on there, and it's virtually the whole downtown of Toronto.
Thanks, Dawn. Yeah, lots of interest in terms of parking and what the requirements are, what the city's doing, you know, the sort of the shift in land use plans and how that affects some of these considerations and how space is used within the urban boundary. And some people have noted that with in infill projects or some sites which may be experiencing more intensification, some have observed what's happening to mature trees that may be on site. I know there are a number of initiatives underway, but there are people that could speak to that before we wrap up this evening. Linda, do
Yeah,
you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just going to very quickly mention the urban forest strategy, which is still like the community energy and emissions plan, which I'm telling you should be referenced in the official plan changes. The urban forest strategy, which is also still a draft, is at least mentioned in the official plan. So that's one we need to watch for. It's been dragging out over a couple of years, the completion of that plan. But once the strategy is done, it lays the groundwork for us to be able to start to have a conversation in this community about a private tree bylaw, because I would argue that's a big part of the challenge we're seeing right now. And as we move forward with more intensification, I think we want to ensure we have more protections, not just for public trees, but for private trees. And probably a lot of you can share stories about how even public trees in some situations end up being sacrificed with some of the development projects that move forward. So we definitely need to have, we need more policies and bylaws in place to help us with that. And I think that's also very connected to the green development standards that I was talking about, and you know, streetscapes, and what is the obligation for maintaining public spaces with proper, you know, urban forest canopy cover as redevelopment happens, all of those kinds of pieces. So I would say, you know, and then that's another thing we'll all, you know, if you're all plugged into our networks, we'll be sure to keep you posted. Juby from Environment Hamilton is on this call, and I know Juby's watching closely for that urban forest strategy, and we'll spread the word and make sure that people get engaged when that comes forward. So Zoe, it's after 9, so I guess we should probably wrap up. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. Nancy and I both really appreciate the number of people who've shown up, and thanks to Zoe for helping out with monitoring the chat and the questions. Thanks to everyone who'd asked questions or added your opinion to all of this. Just want to say again, please, we really urge you to get engaged in the city's process. Feel free to follow up with us if you have any other questions. Watch for that email from me tonight, because I promise you it's coming through on the email tonight before I go to bed. Nancy, I'll hand it over to you if you have any final words.
No, I just want to say thanks, Linda, for all your continued efforts all the time to reach out to everybody, and for pulling this all together. And thank you, Zoe, for helping with all the background stuff. Really very appreciated.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.